Before I formally introduce the center, I just wanted to tell those of you that are new to the Wilson Center a little bit about our history. You may know that Woodrow Wilson was the only president to have earned a PhD, that in his era he was a very prominent and much published political scientist. So when Congress decided in 1968 to honor him, they decided against another marble statue or monument on the Mall and instead created this living memorial. And the assignment they gave the center was to bring both sides of his life together, the academic side, the policy research side, together with the people that are making and influencing policy, Senator Coons being a prime example. Over the course of a year, we'll have 150 people that come here to do research on one aspect of public policy or another. And we also have programs that really cover every aspect, every geographic corner of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so forth. And then a number of programs like my own that, in a sense, are cross-cutting. And my program focuses a lot on innovation here and elsewhere around the world. Well, now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Senator Chris Coons. I think most of you have his biography, but I have to single out a couple notable elements. That, in addition to having a Yale Law degree, he has a master's in ethics from Yale Divinity School. So he speaks, I think, with an added degree of authority on matters of public policy. He has been, since his term here in the Senate, very focused on jobs and job creation and innovation and manufacturing. I think his first bill really was Job Creation Through Innovation Act. And more recently, he has collaborated with Senator Marco Rubio, who also is much in the news, on the American Growth, Recovery, Empowerment, and Enterprise Act, which as an acronym says AGREE, which is an example of how bipartisanship still can exist in Washington. The senator has expressed an interest in making some remarks, and then he was willing to take a few questions.
Great. Would you rather I speak?
I think that's fine.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Kent, and thank you for the great work of the Wilson Center, and thank you all for an opportunity to be with you this morning. I do have a somewhat unusual background for a senator. I have a degree in chemistry as well as a degree in political science. It is something that pales in comparison to the intellectual legacy of Woodrow Wilson, but I am the sole founding member of the Chemist Caucus in the Senate of the United States. And being from Delaware and from both a state and a family of inventors, innovators, and patent holders gives me, I think, an unusual perspective. I spent 8 years as in-house counsel to a materials-based science company before beginning what was a decade in county government. And that balance of private sector and public sector experience in my own community gives me both a window into U.S. competitiveness and innovation and its role in the world, and the challenges that local and federal governments face in creating a sustaining and supportive environment in which a business can grow and high-quality private sector jobs can continue to contribute to our ongoing recovery. The Council on Competitiveness, with which Kent was long associated with, actually played a central role in sort of pulling me into public life. While I was still at W.L. Gore & Associates as in-house counsel, the Council on Competitiveness, which benefited somewhat from the real leadership of the former CEO of DuPont, a personal friend, Chad Holliday, issued a report on Delaware specifically that sort of reviewed and challenged some of our long-held positive notions about how great we were and ranked us near the bottom in entrepreneurship as a state. And that led to a very broad group of folks from the private sector to launch a new initiative for state innovation and to try and strengthen tech transfer at our University of Delaware and Delaware State, both of which, a decade later, I'll report, have been really very successful. My first month that I was here in Washington as a new senator, I went to the Council on Competitiveness dinner where Chad was being honored, assuming there'd be 20, 30 at least of my colleagues, maybe with the throng that would come over from the House, maybe 70 or 80. I was the only member of Congress to show up at that dinner. There were dozens of CEOs, presidents of colleges and universities. There were 2 retiring House members, one of whom promptly sort of leaned over the podium and started wagging his finger at me about how I needed to take on the mantle of getting the America Competes Act reauthorized. I'm sitting here texting going, what is the bill number and its current status? I've been a senator for a week. It was a striking reminder that although the framework of the America Competes Act, which was co-sponsored by Senators Alexander and Senator Bingaman, brave, strong, tough, important, valuable stuff that came out of rising above the gathering storm, it is a challenge to get broad engagement, Republican, Democrat, House, and Senate, on issues of innovation and competitiveness. And so that's something I have tried to really turn myself to in my role as someone who serves on judiciary, which allows me some window into intellectual property, as the chair of the Africa Subcommittee on Foreign Relations, where I'll be chairing a hearing later today on trade opportunities and U.S. Economic engagement with Africa as one of, I think, the most promising spheres for economic activity in this decade and going forward, as well as budget and energy. I have a strong focus on alternative energy and energy exports, and in budget, frankly, if we can't fix our budget, we're not going to have a competitive economy and country for the long term. So in my view, I've had a couple of surprises. I've already mentioned one when I came to Washington. The other was just the partisanship and just how divisive and how grinding it is. In Delaware, we talk about the Delaware way, something in which all of us, Republican, Democrat, state, and local, work together. We deliver balanced budgets on time every year, city, county, state, without a lot of drama, and that's just expected. That doesn't happen here routinely, I've discovered. We are, in fact, our whole congressional delegation working hard to name one of our major new federal investments after a Republican congressman, long a partner, a colleague to all of us, although we're all Democrats. We actually know and like each other. So one of the things I was trying to find in my first few months was good partners I could work with across the aisle. And just by happy coincidence, a Delawarean who had relocated to South Florida and been very successful in business texted me the day after the election and said, "You should get to know this Marco Rubio." Well, just from a superficial outside view, the only thing Marco Rubio and I had in common was that we both owed our election in no small part to the Tea Party. Other than that, we seem to be quite distinct. Yes, that's a joke that takes a minute to process, isn't it? And as I sort of looked at his background and some of his views, I thought initially, wow, we're really not going to agree on much of anything. But she kept persisting, and she texted and emailed and called several times over several months. And I went online, don't tell him it was at Amazon, and got a copy of a book that he had written when he was in leadership in the Florida General Assembly and worked through it. And it actually had some compelling ideas that I could endorse and that I thought, here's a guy who is actually thinking. He's innovating. He's putting forward good public policy ideas. I disagree with him on a number of important political principles, and there's plenty of areas where we disagree. But after that experience and another, we ended up starting to work together on the AGREE Act that was mentioned in the introduction. The other experience was he has 4 young children in South Florida. I have 3 children in Wilmington, Delaware. And we both, frankly, desperately want to get home to them whenever we can. So on a Thursday, much like this one, where there was a whole lot of work piling up on the floor, when both of our respective caucus leaders were on the floor, there should be a more polite word than this, but beating the snot out of each other for a long period of time, just vigorously disagreeing. That's probably the better way to put it. We started talking to each other about the frustrations of being here rather than home and of what people from our home states think when they watch us having these endless Punch and Judy shows on the floor of the Senate. So we began to work through that, and this really was a collaborative effort by our staff and by us individually as senators, where we challenged each other. I turned to him and said, have you ever even really read the Obama administration's jobs proposals, which you are now sort of routinely voting against? And he said, have you ever really read the following proposals from the House Republican majority, which are coming over and are dying here unconsidered? And we, as might not surprise you, when we looked at what was in both of those, we found a dozen or so that had some real overlap. And we winnowed it down to 9 major provisions, put a bow on it, and introduced it. And the snappy acronym AGREE suggests sort of roughly what one of our main goals was, which was to inspire some confidence in the marketplace that 2 freshmen from really divergent political views really could find areas of commonality on tax, on trade, on immigration, on intellectual property, things that are important to sustaining a marketplace of innovation in the United States. And that, actually, we've had some good success so far with the 9 main provisions of the AGREE Act. We didn't sort of kick this off with a big flashy press conference and sort of demand that it be taken up by leadership. We instead worked diligently to get a corollary introduced in the House, to expand the circle of co-sponsors, and to sort of press some of the ideas into consideration by others and in other provisions that we thought might well move. 2 of them have already been made law. The Sarbanes 404B on-ramp in the Jobs Act and by executive order, something the Customs and Border Patrol can and should do and are now doing in order to alert rights holders if there are counterfeits coming into the United States. There's 2 additional provisions we expect to be passed hopefully next month in our next work period, included in a bigger bipartisan jobs package. The next iteration of this is a bill which I suspect is the main focus of your discussion today, Startup 2.0. We joined forces with Senators Warner and Moran, who also had some interesting proposals and ideas in a bill they'd done, the Startup Act. And by combining the AGREE Act with the Startup Act, we managed to work out something in combination. She's got a note for you. Cool. In combination, this is legislation that was designed to promote innovation and jumpstart our economy through the creation and growth of new businesses and jobs, and is based on research that I suspect is familiar to all of you that shows that for more than 30 years, it is companies that are less than 5 years old that have created most of the net new jobs in the United States. And in particular, to focus on those companies that have really high growth potential, so-called gazelle companies that will go not from 1 to 2 to 3 employees, but from 5 to 50 to 500. And I know you're going to have a much more thorough and detailed conversation about the provisions within Startup 2.0. And I don't want to move on past this point without thanking the Kauffman Foundation for their really very good intellectual work in the mechanisms of how we strengthen the entrepreneurship economy in both my little state of Delaware, where they've contributed meaningfully, but also in the very sort of guts of Startup 2.0. I don't think it's appropriate for us as a Congress, just because it happens to be an election year, to stop working on innovation and to say nothing's going to happen between now and November and let's just hope it all gets fixed in the lame duck. I think it's important to keep putting forward substantive bipartisan policy proposals for consideration, even if they aren't going to get passed in the month of July, so that we keep moving the ball forward, recognizing that almost regardless of the outcome of this election, presidential and congressional, we will have divided government, more likely than not. And we need to find strong policy ideas that can move even in a divided government environment. Let me talk, if I could, through 3 other proposals that I'm currently shopping.
Melissa just said that.
Okay, well, that's lovely. Then I need to speed up dramatically, I suspect. She says I need to leave in 4 minutes. So we're going to see if I can talk without taking a breath. There's 3 pieces of legislation I'm going to just briefly reference then. One is an immigration provision that I co-sponsored with Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who, like Woodrow Wilson, benefited from having been president of a university as well as Secretary of Education. It's important because it allows those who pursue master's and doctoral programs in science, math, engineering, and technology in the United States to get green cards without a cap, without stealing those green cards from other provisions or providing them in ways that constrain other opportunities for immigration. It's called the Smart Jobs Act, and it is, I think, one important step towards fixing our highly broken immigration system. I recognize and champion other efforts, and the America Competes Act laid a lot of the foundation for this, to strengthen STEM education for U.S. nationals in our schools from elementary school on up, but there are vast gaps in employment opportunities and the skills available in the U.S. national workforce that we are currently not addressing, and we are simply forcing back to their countries of origin thousands and thousands of very high-skilled individuals who then set up companies or work for companies which directly compete with the United States. This is almost the definition of self-defeating activity. Quick example, K.R. Sridhar, who started Bloom Energy, came to the United States from India as a graduate student, has made groundbreaking innovations in solid oxide fuel cells. KR and his company just broke ground on a manufacturing site in Delaware that will employ up to 900 people, reviving a long, stagnant now manufacturing site critical to my hometown. Master limited partnerships, probably not a part of your daily menu. Master limited partnerships are a long-existing, more than 30-year-old tax-advantaged capital formation vehicle for the midstream oil and gas industry. So overwhelmingly taken advantage of by pipelines, oil and gas, and some other extractive industries. Why is this relevant? I've been watching on the floor as my caucus goes after tax subsidies or tax programs that benefit oil, gas, and other sort of traditional fossil fuels. The other party has gone ceaselessly after those tax incentives that advantage alternative energy. Taking MLPs and opening them up by statute is a 200-word bill, so that renewable sources of power generation and distribution are also able to access master limited partnerships. It's a very simple way of listening to the other party and saying, okay, if we don't want to pick winners and losers in technology, and we want an all-of-the-above energy strategy, why not take this existing vehicle? There's about 100 MLPs with about $350 billion in market cap right now, and make it open to fossil as well as alternative. I think it shows some real promise, and Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas has been a great partner in introducing it. We are seeking a number of co-sponsors, and I've gotten very positive responses from Republicans and Democrats, both on and off the Finance Committee. Intellectual property, one of the things that matters most to me is protecting American intellectual property. We recently had a hearing on the Judiciary Committee, to which I'm soon to go, where Kapos, head of the Patent and Trademark Office, gave an update on the America Invents Act, passed into law last year, signed by the President. It's the biggest change in American intellectual property law, particularly pertaining to patents, since the 1930s. Harmonizes U.S. and multinational systems in terms of first to invent versus first to file. We're making real progress in that area, but there's other areas to which I hope we will soon turn. Senator Cole and I are co-sponsoring a bill creating a private right of action for trade secret theft in the next work period. DuPont, a little company you may have heard of from my state, a mom-and-pop startup now 200 years old. I guess Pop was named Eluthair, so it's a little unusual. But they recently got a $900 million judgment against a South Korean company that had stolen the trade secrets for the production of Kevlar. Trade secret theft is a very real problem for small, early-stage and startup companies that don't have the vast resources of a litigation department like DuPont to pursue it ceaselessly, and I am very concerned about the wide-scale theft of U.S. intellectual property around the world. Senator Feinstein and I are also working on something called a patent box, which I hope is familiar to you. Someone with a great marketing department will help us come up with a better name than a patent box, but it's a way to create a tax advantage for, to put it simply, manufacturing here what you invent here. Most Americans know that the guts of this were invented here and that the actual device is being manufactured overseas, and they would like to see us sustain in the United States as much of the actual practice of intellectual property through manufacturing as possible. And a patent box currently in place in several other countries, principally the United Kingdom, suggests why that would be possible and attractive. Last idea that I've been pressing recently is to take the R&D tax credit, long established, really accessible only to large, profitable companies, and open it up to startup companies. What do I mean? The R&D tax credit, which is in theory great tax policy, in practice has been very uneven. It's allowed to expire as it currently is, and then renewed and restored retroactively. That's happened more than a dozen times. So my very first bill, referenced in the introduction, thank you again, Ken, would make it permanent. But making it permanent isn't enough, in my view. Making it accessible to companies in their first few years, when they're pouring money into R&D, and when they don't yet have the ability to access the tax liability, the carry forward that they generate by overinvesting and not yet being profitable. By making the R&D credit something that startup companies could access, you broaden participation in the R&D credit, and you give extra incentive for companies to start in the United States and to invest heavily in R&D, even pre-profitability. It's a slightly more complex idea in order to make sure that it prevents fraud and scores positively. We've narrowed it to below $250,000 or 20% of W-2 liability. And I think we're going to find some strong co-sponsors for introduction again in the next work period. Those are just a few ideas of things that I'm excited about working on that are contributions in a bipartisan way, whether I've worked with Senators Moran or Senator Alexander, whether Senator Rubio or Senator Warner from my own party. One of our real challenges is sustaining a culture of innovation and sustaining a willingness on the part of senators from both parties to seek out policy proposals that can make it in a sharply partisan environment. The Jobs Act went from an idea to law in a relatively brief period of time. This had to do with capital formation for very early stage companies. It is my hope that some of the suggestions which I've just laid out to you currently, either in bills or in policy proposals, will also see the light of day and make progress even before the election. Thank you for a chance to be with you. And I have time to take one question if I could, so make it a really good one.
The gentleman here in the front, just wait for the microphone if you would.
Hi, I'm Stephen Colty, and I worked at the State Department and started the Global Entrepreneurship Program and recently left state. One of the key elements of that program is the use of American entrepreneurship expertise in the service of American foreign policy. As somebody who, as far as I'm concerned, is really the leader in Congress on this whole issue of innovation and entrepreneurship, and I tip my hat to you very much for being in that position. I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly because I know that you also have international interest in Africa, particularly, and I agree with you. It's a huge opportunity. So can you just talk about that for a minute?
I'm glad you referenced that. As I think I mentioned in passing, we have a hearing this afternoon on the Africa Subcommittee. Senator Isaacson of Georgia, great partner in this work, Republican, and a terrific leader. We're going to have in front of us at this hearing folks from state, from USTR, and from USAID, which is playing a fairly strong contributing role in strengthening economic systems and in creating opportunity in Africa through the private sector as well as through development and relief work. But we're going to have a second hearing in July, and would certainly welcome content, advice, and input, where we're going to try and get the, I don't even want to call them second-tier agencies, but the facilitating agencies, EXIM, OPIC, USTDA, as well as representatives from the private sector to come and talk about what we can and should do to be stronger. Getting the AGOA third-party fabric agreement reauthorized has taken up a lot of my bandwidth and focus right now, but that's just not enough, in my view. Simply giving trade preferences and having sort of low-value textile and apparel assembly going on in countries like Kenya and Lesotho, Swaziland, and Mauritius is not a robust engagement. And when I get to travel around the world and visit with foreign heads of state, yes, they want access to our markets. Yes, they want foreign direct investment. But you are right. Entrepreneurship is the one thing that sustainably differentiates the United States. There are trade missions all over the continent of Africa, from India, from Brazil, from Russia, from China. And the Chinese, frankly, are delivering far more direct investment than we are. They have eclipsed the United States for the first time in the last 2 years as the lead trade partner for Africa. Entrepreneurship, in part delivered in partnership through the diaspora communities, which are widespread throughout the United States, is a key to stabilizing countries like Tunisia and Morocco, to creating a sense of opportunity and hope, whether in Egypt or Nigeria, and to helping facilitate a transfer not just of technology, not just of direct investment, but also of a culture, an approach to education, and an approach to risk-taking that is unique to the United States. I do think we can and should continue to lay the groundwork for rule of law, for predictable commercial rules, for infrastructure, and for trade and tariff issues that are currently preventing wide-scale entrepreneurship and intra-continental trade in Africa. But more than anything else, we contributed immensely to Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall through the transfer of that whole sort of concept of entrepreneurship. It's cultural, and it'll take a generation or more. But some of the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met anywhere in the world, I've met in rural Uganda, in upcountry Benin. And there is enormous hope for real partnership with the United States and Africa, particularly around this. And I'd love to work with you more on it. Thank you all very much. I apologize I have to.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator, very much. We clearly need to have you back for a longer conversation. This is just, thank you for all you're doing. I'd like to now invite our distinguished panel to join us on the podium here. We have three very distinguished individuals, all of whom, interestingly enough, have spent a good deal of time working on Capitol Hill, although not in an elected position. I remember once Senator Leahy taking the floor of the Senate and claiming that but for the Constitution, staff would be fully in charge. And of course, this thrilled every staff person that worked on the Hill, and it's certainly not true. But nonetheless, these three gentlemen have served with real distinction on the Hill and have gone on to other great things. Let me start just in the order in which they're seated here. To my immediate left, and your right, is Peter Muller. Peter's the Director of Government Relations for the Intel Corporation. We just heard the idea of getting a PhD and having a green card stapled to it, and I think that dates back to Andy Grove, who was then CEO of the Intel Corporation. And previously, Peter, to show how innovative his interests are, was the Government Affairs Director for Genentech, a very high-tech success. He worked on Capitol Hill for a number of members, including Ellen Tauscher, who's very well known for her work in Silicon Valley. To his immediate left is Mike Waring. Mike is the director of the Washington, D.C. office, University of Michigan, and he is the executive director of federal relations for the university as well. He also has a very distinguished career. He was with the National Association of Broadcasters for a number of years. Actually started life as a reporter, commentator in the great state of Iowa, if my memory serves me. He has a BA in journalism from the University of Michigan, but has really plunged into this whole world of innovation. And to his left is Joe Kennedy. Joe has another distinguished background, service on Capitol Hill. He served as a senior economist for a number of years with the powerful and prestigious Joint Economic Committee, and then was the chief economist at the Department of Commerce. I've asked them to each speak about different aspects of the Startup Act 2.0. Asked Peter in particular to talk about the immigration aspects. Mike to give us his sense of how universities view the provisions that would help accelerate the commercialization of university research. And then I've asked Joe to say a word or two about the provisions that deal with regulatory reform and some of the reporting requirements from the Department of Commerce. Peter, why don't we start with you? And they've all agreed to speak for no more than 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for easy questions from the assembled group here.
Great.
Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that, and it's good to be with you here today. You mentioned I worked for Ellen Tauscher, and since we're at the Woodrow Wilson International Center, I should mention that Ellen Tauscher was often referred to as the Jane Harmon of Northern California. So they're very good friends, and I think they both enjoyed that. So
that's marvelous. As you may know, Congresswoman Harmon recently left the Congress to take the job as president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and we're, of course, privileged to have her here.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. It's great to be here, and thank you for putting on this forum. At Intel, we consider high-skilled immigration to be one of the key priorities that we have here in Washington. And it's great that Senator Coons was here. We're very supportive of the bill that he introduced, both the Startup 2.0 bill and the Smart Jobs bill. We think not only are those bills good policy, but what's great about them is that they're bipartisan. And one of the problems with immigration reform for years has been a major roadblock in the way of getting anything done. And if we're going to get anything done, we believe it has to be done in a bipartisan way. So to have leaders in the Senate working in a bipartisan manner on legislation to address this issue, we think is a huge step forward. So we're thrilled to be here. Intel is the world's largest semiconductor designer and manufacturer. We did about $54 billion worth of business in 2011. We have more than 100,000 employees. About half of them are based here in the United States. We do so not only do we design semiconductors and chips, we manufacture them, and about 3/4 of our manufacturing is done here in the United States, and the vast majority of our research and development is done here in the United States. But while we make it here, the majority of it, we sell the majority overseas. So about 3/4 of our revenue comes from overseas. Kent, you mentioned Andy Grove. Another one of our founders was Gordon Moore. And back in 1965, Gordon Moore published an article where he noted that the number of transistors on semiconductors is doubling every 2 years. That became known as Moore's Law, and it's held true for 40 years now. And this development in semiconductor technology has really led to extraordinary achievements in computing. We now have phones and tablets that have more computing power than a whole room full of computers had 10 or 20 years ago. And so our challenge at Intel is to maintain this pace of innovation and to really continue every 2 years to double the power of our technology and to make it better by that much every 2 years. And that's a real challenge. It's hard to do that. And the way we do it, the way we've been able to do it, is to hire highly skilled, highly technical people who are able to bring new ideas and new innovation to the table for us. We make every effort to hire U.S. citizens to do this. It's easier for us. It's cheaper for us. We don't have the paperwork. We don't have the legal filings that we have to do for immigration purposes for foreign-born workers. And so whenever we can, our priority is to hire U.S. workers. But increasingly, when we go to recruit at U.S. universities, and that's where we primarily recruit, is the graduate programs in the STEM fields at U.S. universities, we find that more and more the number of students in those programs are foreign-born. And so that's the universe from which we are pulling, and we find ourselves having to hire more foreign workers if we're going to be able to continue the innovation and the work that we do. And that's why the Startup 2.0 Act is so important, because we really are at a point where we're in a critical need of visas to be able to hire these workers. You may have heard that the H-1B program, which is a temporary program visa that we use to hire people from universities, we've already hit the cap on the number of visas that are allocated every year. So that program, starting in April, we can apply for visas, and there are a total of 85,000 that are available every year. But by June of this year, we hit the cap earlier this month. And so we can't apply for H-1B visas again until April of 2013. And so that puts a real limitation on what we can do. At the same time, there's just not enough permanent employment-based visas, known as green cards. That program is oversubscribed. There are 140,000 of those visas that are issued every year, but the demand is much higher than that. And so that leads to people having to wait years and years before they can actually obtain the visa that makes them a permanent resident. And so during that time, they have to stay on an H-1B visa, which has limitations and makes it difficult for them to really develop roots in their community and to advance in their jobs. So it's a problem that our employees face, and because it's a problem for them, it's a problem for us as a company, and we like to try to address it. So just to give you a sense of how we as a company use the visa programs, at Intel, I said we recruit from U.S. universities. We bring in people with advanced degrees in the STEM fields. We hire them on an H-1B visa. That's good for 3 years. It can be renewed for another 3 years. But almost immediately when we hire them, we apply for a green card so that they can have permanent status. Because we don't want them just on a temporary basis. We want them long-term, and we want them to be with us. We want them to want to be with us long-term. And so we try to make that as doable for them as possible. So we apply for the green card, but depending on where they come from, what country they come from, the wait for a green card can be anywhere from 2 years to 10 years or more. And the reason that varies is that there's a cap on, I said there are 140,000 green cards issued, employment-based green cards every year, but there's a cap in place that says no more than 7% of those green cards can go to people from any one country. The problem is that the vast number of employees that we're hiring are originally from India and China. And the green card system and this cap that's in place fail to recognize that that's the reality of the situation. So if a person is from Iceland, they get a green card pretty quickly. If they're from India, they wait years and years and years. I said this briefly before, but there are real limitations when a person's on an H-1B visa that restrict them in terms of what they can do. And I recently talked to an Intel employee who works in our Folsom, California facility, which is near Sacramento. And he's originally from India. I think he went to school in Minnesota. He's been with Intel for a few years. And his wife recently got married a couple years ago, I think, and his wife got a job in Santa Clara, California, which is maybe a 3-hour drive from Folsom. And so that happens to be, Santa Clara happens to be where Intel has its headquarters. So he was interested in transferring, doing the same job, but just doing it in a different location so that he and his wife could live together in Santa Clara because that's where she got a job. But if he were to do that, he would have to go to the back of the line for his green card because that would be a change in location of where he's doing his work, and therefore he loses his spot for a green card and has to go to the back of the line. So for a year, he didn't do that. He and his wife had a long-distance relationship. But after a year, they said, forget it, we can't do this anymore. And so he said, fine, I'll go to the back of the line. So he moved and now works in Santa Clara. But his wait for a green card is now even longer than it was or that it should have been. the good news is that we were able to keep him, and so for Intel, we're happy that he decided to stay with us. But the bad news is that a lot of employees don't, and they get tired of waiting. They want to buy a house, they want to move up in their careers, they want to take on new responsibilities. Maybe they even want to go to a different company or start their own company, and they can't do that while they're on a H-1B visa. Once they get the green card, they're eligible for all that, but until that happens, they can't do it. So it's a real problem, it's a real issue for our employees. So one of the great things about the Startup 2.0 Act is that it would eliminate that per country cap I talked about. And so green cards would be issued on a first come, first served basis, regardless of what country you come from. There's actually another standalone bill that has already passed the House that would do the same thing. We're trying to get it through the Senate. There's been a couple obstacles, but actually I think we might get it done. But it's great that it's a part of this bill because it shows that there's real bipartisan support to do that. But then also, a part of this bill is creating 50,000 new visas. Not only is that good because it creates new visas, but the system that's set up would allow people to avoid being on an H-1B visa, which is great because it alleviates our problem on the H-1B side, but it also means that they don't have to live in that restricted world for a while. They can go straight on a path to getting a green card. And then, of course, 75,000 visas for entrepreneurs, we think is another great provision of the bill as well. So in conclusion, I again would say we're very supportive of Senator Coons' bill and Senator Moran for doing this bill. We think it's a right step. There are actually a number of other bills that have recently been introduced by other members that would do similar things. There's talk about doing a bill on the House side sometime soon. So despite the fact that it's been very hard for years to do anything on immigration, the good news is that there's a lot of talk, both by Republicans and Democrats, about this issue. They seem to understand its impact on our economy, and there seems to be a desire to want to do it. So it's a tough schedule the rest of this year, but we're cautiously hopeful, I guess, that maybe we can see something done. So.
Thank you, Peter. Sure. Mike, could you say a word or three about commercializing university research?
I can, and I want to thank you for inviting me here today, Kent. Kent and I serve on a task force on American innovation together that focuses on a lot of these issues, and I appreciate the invitation, and I stand in awe, Kent, of someone who can get a room full of people on a hot summer day, and it appears that less than half of them are interns, and that we have the Supreme Court ruling in about 5 minutes. So you've done a really good job of turning out a crowd here, so I appreciate that. So
we checked to make sure they all had health insurance.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I'm going to skip over the immigration piece because I think Peter discussed that, and I think universities are fairly happy with what's in the bill in terms of immigration. I want to focus on the piece about tech transfer and about our faculty that's included in this discussion. Let me give you a little perspective, first of all, about how universities are doing in this area, and then some thoughts about the Section 8, which has a specific language that we would want to talk about and focus on here. I think it's good that senators like Senator Coons and Senator Warner and others are focusing on this whole set of issues about how we create jobs in the economy, how we spur innovation, how we create entrepreneurship. I think it's a recognition of the great success we've had in this country using universities as sort of launching pads through basic research to create new industries, new cures for diseases, new technologies. Many of the jobs that we now have today are the result of that work 20, 30 years ago. So I think that's good that members are focusing on that, and I think it's a great discussion to have about what's the federal role in that, what's the university's role in that, what's the corporate role, and how we're going to make this whole thing happen here. So I applaud their efforts, and we're going to debate some of the fine points, but I think they're on the right track about focusing in this area to try to push forward with the economy. The universities have traditionally had a mission of teaching and research. A lot of us now, particularly public universities, have been more and more focused in the last few years on economic development issues. I can tell you, coming from the state of Michigan, with the kind of unemployment we've had there for a long time, and a recession that started long before the rest of the country's, with the auto industry decline and the loss of a lot of manufacturing jobs there the last 10 or 15 years, that the University of Michigan and our partners, Michigan State, Wayne State, other schools, have really focused in that area because we understand that part of our give back to the state is trying to work through the state's economic issues and what can we do to be helpful in that effort. So we are very much focused on that. My president, Mary Sue Coleman, speaks about this issue a lot as she goes around the state and here in Washington. She is co-chairing this National Advisory Committee on Innovation and Entrepreneurship with the Secretary of Commerce, and they focused a lot of energy in the last couple of years on this very topic. They sent a letter last year, 130 plus university presidents signed it in support of doing more things in this area to try to focus on innovation, entrepreneurship, job creation. Understanding that that's a long process. Money invested today doesn't automatically turn into jobs tomorrow. It's a long-term process, particularly basic research, where you're just asking how the world works and not necessarily applying it at that point to solving a specific problem, although hopefully it will be eventually at some point. But it's very important to our campuses, and I should mention that the private schools also are focusing a lot of their time and effort on this as well. You know, this whole thing came out of the Bayh-Dole Act, which passed a little over 30 years ago. Senators Birch Bayh and Bob Dole, at the end of a Congress, got through this legislation to create this notion that universities ought to have intellectual property rights as an incentive to get that technology out into the marketplace. And I think that system has worked very well. If you look at the history of where we've been, where we started in that first year, a few dozen companies, and now we're looking at hundreds of companies being created on an annual basis with more on the way. I think our tech transfer offices are modifying their operations as we move forward as well. There was a hearing on this just the other day in the House Science Committee. My tech transfer office director was one of the witnesses. And I think you've seen moving more from sort of transactional operations in tech transfer offices to more of actually serving the faculty. How can we help our faculty take these ideas, figure out which ideas are marketable? Can we get a patent for them? Can we license them? Is there somebody ready to take this patent, whether an existing company or a startup, and actually try to make a business out of this technology or this healthcare thing that we've created on our campus? So we're seeing less focus on the dollars, more focus on the process and how we succeed in the process. We've seen lots of universities, including mine, developing seed funds of their own to try to help bridge this gap between the idea and the actual company formation. So we're seeing, for example, in my state, we've created our own gap fund where we're trying to help some of our own faculty work out the kinks of how they get their technology into a way that could be marketable. We've also created a program with other universities around the state where we're actually trying to help them, using our expertise, to help strengthen their own tech transfer operations around the state. So you're seeing a lot more of that focus on proof of concept. Incubators, we have incubator space now on our campus where we're actually starting companies in our own building and trying to grow them out of the building and put in others. Mentoring programs to help teach people how to do tech transfer, how to run a business, and so all that sort of thing. Entrepreneurship is huge at the University of Michigan and at a lot of universities. So the issue is, where do you get the resources for that? And some schools have those. Other schools are searching for those. And it's not easy. Some schools are more well-positioned to take advantage of that than others. And the fact that the culture, most faculty are not by nature business people. They are researchers. They focus on their research. And so we want to surround those people with people who are business people who can then see where's the marketability, where's the patentability, where's the licensability of some idea that they've created, and can we then take that to term and bring that out as a finished product into the marketplace. So I think you're seeing a lot more work in that area, and I know that universities are spending a lot of time on that effort, and we appreciate Congress's interest in trying to figure out ways they can be helpful to us. So let me speak specifically now about the Startup Act 2.0, and specifically Section 8, which is the area that I want to focus on here, which creates a couple new grants programs at the Department of Commerce that are focused on accelerating the commercialization of research coming from federally funded research agencies. There's one grant program is commercialization capacity building, and the other is commercialization acceleration grants. I think the capacity grants are something that we like, generally speaking. I think we do have some concerns about the funding mechanism. One of the ways that this new program is going to be funded is by taxing research programs throughout the government at the rate of 0.15% for all their grants. That doesn't sound like much, but when you look at the breadth of the federal research portfolio, it's millions and millions of dollars being diverted from research to be given to the Department of Commerce to try to figure out how to turn that research into something. And the way in which it's used is also of some concern. The grant would be given to universities that allow faculty to directly commercialize research in an effort to accelerate breakthroughs. So this is somewhat of akin to what is being referred to a little bit as called free agency, where faculty would be free under a totally free agency scenario where they could actually, if they had an idea, they could then take it anywhere. If they found something at Michigan, they could take it to MIT and have it developed. That's a problem for a number of reasons. First of all, there's conflicts of interest and public accountability. The grant goes to the university, and the intellectual property is owned by the university and shared with the inventor. So the notion that a faculty member could suddenly take that on his or her own to some other university to develop and to try to market does not fit that model. And there would be a lot more negotiations involved to try to create a system like that. And it would simply slow down technology transfer rather than resolve it. The other problem is that universities are so focused on their own technology, they're not interested in taking other people's technology. They want to work on the stuff that they themselves have created. Faculty work for the universities. They are employees. What they do on university time is university product. And so that's part of this whole enterprise. And so we need to keep that in mind. I mentioned I was talking to a Senate office about this a few weeks ago, and I said, well, this is sort of like if you wrote a speech for your boss, but then said, wait a minute, Senator so-and-so down the hall here gives much better speeches. I'm going to let him read it instead of have you read it. And they all went, oh, I see. So I think that's the issue here is how we're going to have the intellectual property dealt with in a reasonable way. Our tech transfer offices, by and large, are really good at figuring out marketplaces, at figuring out where there's a market for a product, how to sort of use it, who are the local players, where can we get venture capital. And I think taking that, if you want intellectual property to leave your state, then you want free agency because it's going to go to about 2 or 3 places around the country, and it's not going to stay in your state and grow jobs and grow development there. Faculty are not entrepreneurs inherently. They're really not business people. That's our job to help them create businesses, and they can become business people with our assistance. But this notion that they can just sort of wander around with their intellectual property, which is really our intellectual property as well, is really not helpful to the process. You see other countries actually moving towards our model as opposed to this model. They're saying, we want to create this system where universities and faculty share the IP and then have an incentive together to try to market that. And so I think groups like Autumn, of which I serve as Assistant Vice President for Advocacy, the Association of University Technology Managers, spends a lot of time talking to people in tech transfer offices and doing best practices and training people on how to be better at it. The solution is not to take intellectual property from universities that maybe aren't as good as MIT or Stanford or Michigan. It's to help those campuses where they are located, strengthen those operations so they can be more effective. And that's what we try to do in Michigan. That's what we should be doing around the country. So I think the issue there is we need to fix that language, I think, before we can move forward with this bill as far as we're concerned on that aspect. And rather than maybe have the money go for these sorts to the faculty, maybe it should go more towards ways in which we can provide innovative approaches to encourage and support faculty and to generate ways of moving things to the marketplace more quickly. So rather than shopping IP around the country, we ought to think about what are some programs we could actually use that money for that would actually accelerate this issue. And again, the tax issue is really a problem because it does end up being a lot of money. When you start taking 0.15% of people's research budgets, it's hundreds of millions of dollars across the federal government. And at a time when research budgets are barely growing at all, that's really a problem. It's going to inhibit our research capabilities rather than accelerate them. So there are a lot of good things in this bill. We have some concerns about these particular pieces. We have been negotiating with the senators, particularly Senator Warner and Senator Moran, about these provisions, hoping to find an accommodation there. We'll continue to work on that. But I do want to say that by and large, a lot of that bill is good and that we do support the goals that they're trying to achieve. And I think, again, it recognizes the importance of universities in this continuum of creation of ideas, developing, is there a market for it? What is that market? How do we license it? Who are the licensees, existing or new companies? And how do we get that technology moved through the process more quickly?
Thank you, Mike. Joe, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate being here. I'm going to talk about sections 9, 10, and 11 of the Act. Section 9 changes rulemaking standards for administrative bodies, and sections 10 and 11 require 2 reports from the Department of Commerce. Section 9 is part of a long, or is another step in a long history of trying to get a better handle around rulemaking. Currently, the rulemaking process is driven by the Administrative Procedures Act of 1946, which stemmed from a concern expressed by people like President Roosevelt that the agencies were becoming an extrajudicial or extra-constitutional fourth branch of government. In the APA is a great a piece of legislative work. In theory, it allows Congress to concentrate on the rough, broad goals that it wants to achieve in legislation and leave the details to the agencies, which presumably have more intimate knowledge of the markets that they're supposed to regulate. And the whole process is based on several components that collectively are supposed to help the agencies and the public develop regulations that are in the broad general public interest, whereas legislation is necessarily a political procedure or act. It's written, legislation's written by people who have to run for re-election every couple of years and have to distinguish themselves from their opponents from the other party. The agencies are supposed to concentrate on the science or the actual facts of the issues before them. Some of the main components are the requirement for an open record so that the public can see what the agencies are, what information they're considering, who they're meeting with. Adequate opportunity for the public to comment, not just on the broad issues that the agencies are regulating, but also on the specific regulations agencies are considering. The requirement for the building of a record and the requirement that the agency justify its final regulation based on that record, and the ability of courts to oversee that process and strike down regulations that aren't justified by the record. And yet, despite this great act, we have a morass of regulation that many people think is out of control. At least since Nixon, presidents have struggled to organize the rulemaking process within their administrations. And at least since Reagan, cost-benefit analysis has been part of that requirement. Currently, the process is driven by an executive order issued by President Clinton in 1993, which was slightly amended by an executive order by President Obama last year. The Startup 2.0 Act amends Section 553 of the Administrative Procedures Act, and that's the section that sets out the main requirements for rulemaking that an agency has to follow. It adopts many of the provisions of the Clinton executive order. It would apply to major rules, and those are defined slightly broader than the Clinton executive order. They include all rules with an annual effect of $100 million or more, but they also include rules that would have a major increase or would cause a major increase in prices or costs, or that would have significant economic or competitive effects on the economy. The Act would require that before issuing a proposed rule, agencies would have to conduct a review that would cite the specific market failure or other problem that justifies the rule. They would have to explain the expected impact of their proposed rule on the ability of new businesses to form or expand. They would have to analyze the impact on state and local governments, as well as look for conflicting or duplicative regulations. And then they would have to also analyze whether existing laws or regulations had contributed to the problems that the new regulation is trying to correct. And most of these are taken from the Clinton executive order. The act would also require that all agencies promulgating major rules conduct a cost-benefit analysis. And they would have to look at all the costs and all the benefits, try and quantify those where possible. They would have to also look at feasible alternatives to the regulation they're proposing, and are encouraged to pick the one with the greatest cost-benefit ratio. And again, that's taken largely from the Clinton executive order. And then finally, this whole process, this whole review process or analysis would have to be made public. Importantly, there's a provision in the law that says that there can be no judicial review of the adequacy of this process. The Act also doesn't include a proposal that Senator Warner had made, I think in 2010, to establish a regulatory pay-go system under which an agency would have to eliminate one existing regulation for every new one that it wanted to add. What does Section 9 add if we already have the Clinton executive order? Well, I think, one, it requires an analysis of the effect of regulations on startups. More importantly, this cost-benefit analysis requirement would apply to the independent agencies, whereas the executive orders had not, largely because I think there was some concern, there were some questions about how much constitutional power the president had to make additional requirements on the rulemaking powers of independent agencies. Congress clearly has that power and is exercising it in this act. And then I think it's also very good for these requirements to be put into legislation, to have the support of Congress, and to have more certainty. Whereas an executive order can be changed or eliminated by succeeding presidents, these requirements now are part of the permanent legislation. I do, however, see some problems with this. The main problem I think that we have with regulation is not, a lack of attempts to constrain it or to reform it. We've had the establishment of our IRA in 1980, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, Congressional Review Act. The problem is that there's no effective policeman making sure that agencies actually do consider cost-benefit analysis and take it seriously. The agencies typically don't pay a lot of attention to it. They write very large reports, but you look at their agency staffs, there aren't a lot of economists. The main policeman is OIRA, which is part of the executive branch and is therefore necessarily political. And even OIRA, it isn't very clear what powers it has to kick back regulations that don't meet cost-benefit criteria. So I think there are several things that might make a difference. One is to give courts the power to strike down regulations that aren't supported by adequate cost-benefit analysis or whose costs exceed their benefits. Combined with that, you could change the great deference that the APA tells courts to give to agencies. Another proposal that's been made is to require a vote in Congress before any major regulation can take effect. That obviously, if that was going to happen, you'd have to have procedures whereby the agency was guaranteed a quick vote up or down. And finally, there's been another proposal that for sunsetting regulations and requiring agencies to repromulgate them. Moving on to Section 10 and 11, Section 10 requires that the Department of Commerce, within 18 months and then every 2 years thereafter, put out a report that looks at state laws and analyzes the extent to which they either encourage or restrict business formation and growth. And then Section 11 requires another report, also due out in 18 months, but this one would also require a new report quarterly that would conduct a broad survey of businesses that are under 1 year in age to try and understand the role that these businesses play in the broader economy and to understand the factors that influence them. I think these are good ideas. The problem, again, is that there isn't a lack of studies in the country with respect to the laws that restrict business formation and growth. Kaufman has done a lot of great work. Institute of Justice has done a lot of great work on identifying, for example, licensing requirements that basically protect incumbents and make it much more difficult for new entrants to form a business that would compete with existing businesses. The problem is nobody seems to act on the knowledge within these reports. And so I think that's, we need to work on that.
Thank you, Joe. I think the only reservation people might have is that call for more economists in the federal government. Well, let's open it up for questions from you all. Who would like to pose the first question? Lady right there. If you could please identify yourself and then wait for the microphone. Who's right by you?
I'm Patty McAllister. I'm with the Council of Graduate Schools, and my question is for Peter. In terms of Intel's hiring of international students with advanced degrees, do you have any information on how that breaks out in terms of doctoral versus master's students?
Yes, I don't have the exact number, but it is a large percentage of master's students. We certainly hire PhDs. I'm hesitant to say a number because I don't want to be wrong about it and put a number out there. I can get it for you though afterwards if you're interested, because that's actually a key issue. And as legislation is being developed, one of the questions is whether it should these new visas should be available to people who get PhDs and masters or just PhDs. And we're of the strong opinion that it should be both. People with masters perform vital roles within our company and many of the other tech companies that we work with. And so in our view, if we're going to address the issue, it really needs to include master's students. And the percentage, to try to answer your question, is much higher of masters than PhDs for us, but we certainly do hire both.
Gentleman in the...
Just to follow up to that,
Please introduce yourself.
My name's Tommy. I work for the Census Bureau on the R&D and Innovation Survey. Is there a limit per company for the application you can submit for the H-1Bs?
No, there's no limit for a company. There's a total cap on how many are available
85,000
each year, but no limit for a company.
So I guess my question is, are those mostly used up by the Intels of the world, the 85,000 quota?
It's a mix. There's certainly large companies like us that use a good percentage of them, but I think our number, I don't know for this year how many we applied for. A couple years ago, I think we applied for something like 900. That puts us in, on the higher end, but not the top. There are some companies that applied for more than that. But then there are also lots of startup companies, small companies that are applying. So I don't know the exact number, but I think that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that are applying for H-1B visas every year.
Peter, is that currently on a first-come, first-served basis?
It is. The application process opens in April every year. And going back to the tech boom of 10 years ago or so, there were years where the number of applications hit the limit on the very first day that the door opened. As the economy has gone down in recent years, the date at which the cap was hit was pushed back and back. But now, in the last couple of years, we've seen it creeping up earlier again. And so I think the cap was hit in November last year. It was hit in June already this year.
I know in the Doha round, which may or may not be going anywhere, India's position has been to negotiate an increase in that cap. Is there any prospect for that happening?
I don't know. We talk about whether trade deals can be opportunities to increase visas, and that's something that we're interested in pursuing. There have been trade deals in the past that have included additional visas. I don't know the exact answer to the Doha question, though.
There's the gentleman here in the front row. And I saw a hand for, yes, the gentleman over there.
James Sang. Can I ask two questions? One
two
for Peter
questions, yes,
and
I
one
will.
Okay. For Peter, for much of the late 90s and early part of this decade, this immigration question was very divisive in IEEE. And I was wondering if I used to be a member, I'm not a member anymore. I was wondering if you could bring me up to date on what the professional society's attitudes, so as especially the engineering society attitudes to it. And Michael's after next.
Okay. I'm hesitant to speak for IEEE, although I'll say that we work with IEEE on some aspects of this. We use the H-1B visa program because we have to. I think it's fair to say IEEE is not a fan of the H-1B program, but I think that they feel much better about the green card and the permanent visas because it doesn't restrict employees the way the H-1B does. And so we have worked with them to try to increase the number of green cards. We're in coalitions with them and have worked with them. And so I think it's fair to say we're on the same page in terms of increasing the number of green cards and doing the types of things that the Startup 2.0 Act would do.
And for Mike, we've talked about the Kaufman Foundation, and they have talked a lot about the complexity of the intellectual property system, the extent to which holding intellectual property, having it spread out over many different sources, can actually block or make it difficult to innovate how you put together the package of patents that applies to a particular device. And this free agency sounds like it would be a partial solution to that kind of problem. I heard Bob Litton complaining about a lot of, Intel sort of stuff. Well, not Intel sort of stuff, but a product that has an Intel processor and some stuff from San Diego, and the complexities it creates. And does this free agency, is that an attempt to try to get around that, to try to ease that problem?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the Kaufman Foundation. I should say, by the way, that there are a lot of good ideas that they have. This is one where we sort of disagree with them, sort of on a fundamental level, because as I explained before, employees of the university, we have this agreement going in that we're going to share the IP. That's the way it's structured through the Bayh-Dole Act, and that we're going to work with them to try to market their intellectual property, hopefully getting a patent and then finding a licensee. The problem is that, there are, at Michigan, for example, I think we had, and I don't have the figure on top of my head, we had almost 100 discoveries last year, 60, 70 discoveries that we actually started to begin to work on patents. But out of that, there was a whole lot of other work going on our campus. Not every idea is going to be patentable, and not every patentable idea is going to have a marketplace. So I think that's where we really need to have people who are familiar with the university, who are familiar with the environment. Most innovation that occurs as a result of university research occurs right in the area surrounding the university. This is why you have things like the Silicon Valley, why you have Boston, Route 128, why you have the Research Triangle, and why in Michigan we now are seeing development around our own campus, because that's where the innovation begins in many ways. And so if you're going to take that IP out of state to develop it or take it to some other university, you're going to lose that local impact. And I'll guarantee you lawmakers are not going to be happy that things we discover at Michigan are going to be developed somewhere else. So I'm not sure it speaks specifically to the issue that you raised, but it does cause a lot of concerns. And I think the notion is, rather than having people sort of hopscotch their IP around the country, let's take the tech transfer offices that are not maybe as effective or need more help in getting to be more effective, and let's help them do a better job at the local level. That's why we're doing mentoring. That's why we're doing collaborations. That's why we're helping them take our expertise and use that around the country and around our state, because we want to make those folks strong and viable competitors. But it's the notion that you can sort of take this IP anywhere you want to sort of belies sort of the basic fundamentals of how this whole system works.
Mike Province. I run a management accelerator for startups, and this question's for Peter. It's kind of the flip side of what you were talking about in terms of visas and green cards for getting employees in. With a couple companies I work with, they've run into situations where they collaborate both with sister companies in other countries, India in particular, or where they are trying to collaborate with other companies, but both companies are small and it's hard to get visas so that they can simply travel to the U.S. to meet. Does this act address any of the shorter-term visa issues around collaboration?
It doesn't, but you're right that that's an issue both for small companies but for big companies as well, because we have employees around the world that we need occasionally to bring into the United States for some temporary basis, and we often use what's called an L1 visa to do that. And there have been difficulties recently with trying to get those visas. This bill, though, doesn't, to my knowledge, doesn't address that part of the problem.
Is there any other legislation pending that would, Peter?
There's a lot of legislation pending. I don't think, to my knowledge, any of it deals with those sorts of temporary visas for bringing an employee who's already a part of our company into the U.S. for just a short period where they're then going to return. I don't think there's anything dealing with that.
Joe, before we go to another question, Joe, I wanted to jump in and ask you about Section 10 that requires that report on state laws that affect or impede or hinder startups. As a former insider at Commerce, is Commerce geared up to do that, or would they have to acquire some new talent to do it?
Well, I think they're probably geared up to do it. I mean, they have both of the Competes Acts required from Commerce a major study of the country's competitive position, and the department issued the most recent one earlier this year. So, and they have within what's called the Economic and Statistics Agency a group of very well-trained PhD economists who do regular studies on a variety of issues. And they also have, because they oversee two of the three main statistical agencies, access to a great deal of data. And of course they have the implicit powers of the Department of Commerce to work with businesses and states to get further data. So I think they have the resources to do it. And I think it's a good report for doing. My suspicion is that it would mirror a lot of previous reports that point out that a lot of the laws that impede business formation or growth basically stem from the ability of incumbents to get local and state and national governments to pass laws or regulations that protect them from new incumbents coming in and basically driving down prices and boosting up quality. And so it'd be a great report to do. We could do it, but we kind of already know what kind of laws are out there that don't make a lot of sense, and the problem is going out and eliminating those laws.
I was thinking of something. I'll come back to that comment. The gentleman in the blue shirt there, and then Brink, did you have a question? If you could please introduce yourself.
David Beer, Competitive Enterprise Institute. This one's for Michael. I'm wondering, since there's such a strong incentive for commercialization already, do you think Congress really needs to be involved in the process, considering the market incentives to commercialize products, particularly by taking it from R&D that's already being used?
I think that's a great question. And I think, congressmen legislate. That's what congressmen do. So their first reaction to solving any problem normally is to pass a law. I tell people when they come to Washington, I say, if you want to know what Congress is going to have a hearing about, look in the paper today. And 2 weeks from now, they'll have a hearing about some story they saw in the paper, and then they'll try to write a law to fix this problem. And I think you'll find that most often we don't need legislation to solve a problem. I think what would be useful, I think there are a lot of things already in place to help this situation. I think what universities are trying to do is help faculty sort of bridge this gap between having this idea and having the resources to actually develop it into a fully marketable product, this valley of death everybody talks about, this chasm between the original spark of an idea and then trying to turn that into something that then could be commercialized. Funding in that realm might be very helpful from the Department of Commerce. So maybe the notion ought to be not so much funding for moving IP around, but actually creating opportunities where people could tap into resources to sort of tide them over while they finalize and fully develop this idea into a product that might then be sellable. So I think I think you've touched on something there, and I think, Congress is full of people with very good backgrounds, very well-intentioned, but not always, legislation is not always the right solution to the problem. And I think you've hit upon something there, that there are maybe other ways to deal with this. Funding might be helpful, but I do think that there are incentives now in the process, and I think all of our tech transfer offices are now much more cognizant of this notion of how do we get this process moving? How do we help identify these technologies that actually have a market life or a sellability, and how do we then get them licensed to the right people and get them out in the marketplace and start either as a spin-off, or startup, or to an existing company. And sometimes those existing company transfers are harder to track because they're part of a much bigger portfolio, so they don't stand out as much. But a lot of times, that's also a very effective way to do tech transfer. I should also say at the beginning, I should have said this at the beginning, but I'll say it now. The most important tech transfer universities do is the knowledge to the students. That is the primary function, is that transfer of knowledge from faculty to students in the classroom, in the laboratory. That's where you get the bonus of not only the technology that's created, but also the scientists of tomorrow, the future engineer, the future chemist, the future physicist, who will make that discovery 5, 10, 15 years down the road. That's the big investment. That's the big tech transfer. These other things are sort of byproducts of that process, but that's the most important thing that we do, and we should always keep that in the forefront of our mind as we think about this whole enterprise of how we take these ideas and turn them into marketable products and cures and for diseases and that sort of thing.
Before we go to Brink, I've just handed a card about a Supreme Court decision that may be of passing interest to some of you. The Supreme Court has upheld the health care mandate.
Wow.
Brink?
Sounds like another opportunity for the Wilson Center to have a hearing, the session here, Ken.
Hi, Brink Lindsay from the Kauffman Foundation, and since the Kauffman's name has come up a couple of times, I thought I would chime in and particularly press Michael Waring just a bit on the free agency issue, since that's an issue that my colleagues at Kauffman have been identified with. You mentioned a conflict of interest problem, that the university is an owner of this intellectual property, and yet it would lose control over the commercialization process. There is another conflict of interest going on at the same time, though, and that is the interest of academics to commercialize their research, Many of them have experienced great frustrations in waiting in long queues at their technology transfer office or dealing with technology transfer offices that may not be as world-class as the University of Michigan's. And so how does one deal with that problem? You mentioned that the solution is to kind of upgrade and capacity build so that other technology transfer offices are better. There's hundreds or thousands of universities in the United States where research is being done. It's really kind of unthinkable that they're all going to be really, really good. It's also the experience in almost all domains that the best way to catalyze superior performance is to unleash competition, that competition tends to provide very sharp incentives for people to up their performance. So the theory here must be that somehow or another in technology transfer, monopoly power conduces to more effective performance than competition. Finally, on the local impact question, where the technology gets commercialized ultimately is as up in the air when the local TTO deals with it as it would be if another agent is involved. That is, the product could be commercialized to an out-of-state company or whatever. But in any event, let's assume that perhaps a move in the direction of more competition leads to more out-of-state movement of commercialization activity. This is a piece of federal legislation. The purpose of it is to help the U.S. economy overall. The fact that there may be parochial interests that are harmed in that doesn't really seem to be the point. So maybe you could respond to some of that.
Well, I think I laid out kind of our thoughts specifically related to this legislation. And we could have a much longer debate, I think, about these issues. I think we've had people like Stanford and MIT who are well known for their tech transfer say that they're not interested in taking other people's technologies. They don't have the time and effort, and they're certainly not going to have the incentives that someone else's university where their technology was created is going to have to try to exploit that, because they've got plenty of their own to do. So I think that's an issue. Second of all, even if they were going to do that, who's to say that they might not have similar technologies in the same field and might want to say, well, wait a minute, why should we help these people over here with theirs? We've already got a better mousetrap. We're just going to push ours and we'll slow theirs down and delay it. So there's all kinds of inherent issues going on here. The Bayh-Dole Act was very specific about the intellectual property ownership, and it did that for a purpose because it creates an economic incentive for people to do this kind of transactional work. I'm sure there are lots of faculty who feel that their office hasn't serviced them as well as they would like to. And in some cases, they get to have that, if they don't get a patent or if they decide not to move forward, that IP flows back to them and they can try then to find other ways to resolve this issue. But I think by and large, you're going to find the most incentive to come from the people who have hired those people to do that work in that community, who have an incentive, who know the area, who know the region. And I do think that it's in the country's best interest to try to spread that 1,000 flowers around the country rather than having 3 or 4 places that do all of our intellectual property development. I see my friend Kamala Lyon in the back from University of California, and I know that her excellent Berkeley scientists, I'm sure her boss would have a heart attack if they suddenly all walked across the country to MIT or North Carolina to do their commercialization. I just think there's a lot of issues involved here that need to be more fully discussed. And this proposal here, while not sort of pure free agency in that sense, creating these grants to do what? It's not really explained very much in the legislation what the grants would go for. So I'm happy to engage in a further dialogue. I know our communities are. We think you guys do a lot of great work on the whole enterprise area. This is one of these areas where we're going to agree to disagree. But I do think that, at least in my university and in our state, we're doing our part to make sure that ideas that come from Michigan develop in Michigan and help the people of Michigan as well as people around the world. So,
the lady in the back.
And I just want to commend Mike for his great thoughts here and describing the issues that arise with this language. One of the analogies that sometimes we've been using is that we wouldn't want to see an employee, an employee of Intel wouldn't be able to go to Google to commercialize their ideas, and it's not it's not any different in the university setting. If you have IP that's created at your university by your faculty, that is something that that by nature it's similar to the employee relationship at any company in America. The IP it would traditionally stay there, and so this proposal does raise a lot of concerns.
I'm now taking the liberty of reading into Brink's mind, which is always the dangerous thing to do, that he may not be thinking of the Berkeleys and Michigans or MITs or North Carolinas, but of a host of other universities that may not have a innovative cluster nearby and yet come up with terrific ideas. Could there be a, let's say, cross-university agreements so that perhaps a smaller university in a state that wouldn't have the industry and innovative cluster there might partner with the University of Michigan and draw on your skills?
I think you see that already happening in some areas. The issue is what the faculty's rights are, and I think that's where we have a difference of opinion. I think, and so but I do think you see some collaboration. And I mentioned this new program in Michigan called MINTS, M-I-N-T-S, the acronym for which I cannot explain. It's Michigan Innovation something. But we are actually now working assiduously with 6 other universities in the state and taking our people out there and training people how to be better at tech transfer and helping create collaborations. And that's exactly what we should be doing. But that in no way affects who has the intellectual property and how it's marketed. So I think that's the key is you can do that in a thoughtful way. And I think before we start hacking up the federal budget to create funds of money to do certain things, we ought to think about what we're going to use that money for and what's it really going to accomplish. And I'm not sure, as well intended as this legislation is, that piece is as well thought out as it could be. There may be other things we could do with those funds, but this sort of thing is not really where we need to be putting our incentives, in our view.
Joe, I wanted to go back to that report that at least has intrigued me, the Section 10 report looking at state impediments. I'm thinking of a report that the World Bank puts out periodically called Doing Business. Its aspects of it have been controversial with regard to labor rules, but in many cases it simply says, well, you're concerned about, country X is concerned about exports, but it takes you 6 months to get a license, you've got these high port fees, and they can be very specific as to what the impediments are, which in an era, no small measure thanks to Kaufman, we're all thinking more self-consciously about entrepreneurship. Might states not say, well, here's a real guide to action?
Yeah, I think these kinds of reports can be very valuable. And Senator Coons mentioned the effect that the report by your former group had on sort of motivating them to look at how Delaware treated businesses and how it could improve and how it could learn from what other states do. I do think there's great value in looking at the process for creating a business or for growing a business within a state or a metropolitan area and trying to understand better how the various laws and regulations could make that process smoother and easier. But I think a lot of, there are agencies or groups out there that already do similar reports like that, and the impediment seems to be that nobody really wants to. The laws serve somebody's purpose, and nobody really wants to, open up markets for at least the incumbents don't want to open up markets for competition, and governments often, when it comes down to it, are reluctant to let go of the regulatory process and let just anybody start up a business quickly without going through a lot of checks and balances.
We really have time maybe for one more question before they ask the panel for their final independent thoughts. If I don't see any hands, let me go to the panel. Peter, let me start with you if you have a final thought you'd like to add.
thank you again for hosting this forum and putting it on. I think it's been a useful discussion. As I said, we're very encouraged by the Startup 2.0 Act. We think it's a great piece of legislation, a bipartisan piece of legislation. And it's one of now a handful of bills that would try to address the high-skilled immigration issue. So we're, I don't know what the healthcare decision's going to mean for the legislative schedule the rest of the year. Maybe it helps to leave more room to address issues like this. I don't know, but we're hopeful.
Mike?
Well, thanks again, Ken, for inviting me today. I hope I gave a good accounting for kind of our views of this bill. We think this bill has many good things in it. We think there's some tweaks we could do in this particular Section 8 that we'd like to see made, and we're continuing that dialogue. As I said before, I think it's great that members of Congress are recognizing the value and success of this pipeline that we've created over the last 30 years, thanks to the Bayh-Dole Act, and that they want to try to do helpful things. I think the question is, what is the most helpful? I think, well, is there legislation needed? Is it a funding issue? Is it a legislative issue? What's the best approach? I think we're going to continue to wrestle with those. The technology transfer system is not perfect. It never will be perfect. But I think it's gotten a lot better. I think you're seeing more. And if you look at the increase in research spending over the last 20 or 30 years, and then draw a line of how the number of discoveries and inventions that have come out of that, they almost are parallel. It's amazing how the more money we put into research, the more discoveries, the more things we get out of it. So we need to continue to invest, and our message must continue to be that even in hard economic times, growing our investments at NSF, at DOE Office of Science, at NIH, at places like that, pay off in dividends for many years to come, and we need to keep that in the forefront of our mind, and that's sort of the kind of the framework in which we ought to view all these kinds of issues.
Joe?
Yeah, I think no one act or regulation is going to make a overwhelming difference in changing our economy, but this particular act, in combination with others, is a great step forward. I think it's going to come down to, in the end, we have to, as a society, get a lot more excited and confident about the possibilities of technology and future innovations, and get a lot more comfortable with letting go of some of the regulatory restrictions that we've had in the past.
Well, let me conclude by thanking the Kauffman Foundation, who helped support today, and we have a couple more things we hope to do on the entrepreneurial front, and I want to see if I can't do something with regard to charter schools and entrepreneurship, which is, as you talk to people running charter schools, you find that many of them have a very entrepreneurial cast of mind. I want to thank the people who joined us electronically via the web. We were webcasting today, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your questions. They really have been terrific and usefully probing. And I want to thank an outstanding panel for illuminating what is a very promising piece of legislation.